For 200 years, Kalen kept his vow of isolation. The mountain peak became his monastery, the bitter wind his only companion, the endless white expanse his penance. Every morning before dawn, he moved through weapons drills that his body remembered, even when his mind tried to forget. Sword forms practiced until muscle became memory. Defensive stances held until his legs trembled with the effort of remaining still. The discipline kept the ghosts quiet. The routine kept him sane. 342 years he'd walked this earth, and for 200 of them, he'd been running from what he'd done. His hands, scarred and calloused from centuries of warfare, moved through the ancient patterns his first master had taught him when the world was younger and he still believed in honor. The snow beneath his feet had been packed down by decades of the same movements, the same desperate attempt to carve order from chaos, to impose structure on a life that had long ago lost its meaning. The sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the snow gold and crimson. Blood colors. He'd seen enough blood to fill rivers, enough to stain his dreams with the faces of the dead. Some he'd killed in honest combat. Those deaths he could live with. Warriors understood the risk, accepted the possibility that any fight might be their last. But the others, the ones who hadn't chosen, the innocents caught in the machinery of war, those were the ghosts that haunted him through the long winter nights. The wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong to the mountain's usual symphony of ice and stone. A scream, distant but unmistakable, the high, keening wail of someone in mortal terror. Kalen froze mid-movement, his practice sword extended in a guard position that suddenly felt absurd. For 200 years he'd trained for battles that never came, prepared for wars he refused to fight, maintained readiness for a purpose he'd long abandoned. The scream came again, fainter this time, swallowed by distance and the wind's howl. Not his concern, not his war. He'd left that world behind, walked away from responsibility and consequence both. Whatever happened in the valleys below, whatever desperate drama played out in the packed territories he'd once commanded, it had nothing to do with him anymore. He'd paid his dues in blood and guilt. He'd earned his isolation. But his wolf stirred beneath his skin, that ancient predator responding to the scent of blood carried on the mountain air. Fresh blood, newborn blood, mixed with the copper tang of violence and the sharper note of fear. His enhanced senses, honed by centuries of warfare, mapped the source. 3 miles down the southern ridge, maybe 4. A woman, judging by the pitch of that scream. And something else, something smaller, multiple heartbeats where there should be one. Kalen lowered his practice sword and stared out across the vast white wilderness that had been his prison and his sanctuary. Intervening meant returning to the world he'd left, meant becoming involved in conflicts that could only end in the same blood and betrayal that had driven him here in the first place. The smart choice, the safe choice, was to go back to his drills, to pretend he'd heard nothing, to let fate play out however it would without his interference. He drove the practice sword into the snow with enough force to bury it halfway to the hilt and started down the mountain. The tracks told a story even before he found her. A woman's footprints, unsteady and desperate, weaving through the deep snow with the erratic pattern of someone beyond exhaustion. She'd been bleeding, the crimson drops stark against pristine white, and carrying something heavy enough to throw off her stride. Not running in blind panic, but moving with purpose, taking the most defensible route, using terrain to her advantage, even as her body failed her. A warrior's retreat, executed by someone who knew what they were doing, even as everything fell apart. Kalen followed the trail with the ease of long practice, his own feet finding purchase where hers had struggled, his body adjusted to the thin air and brutal cold in ways hers could never be. She'd made it farther than he would have expected. 3 miles through mountain winter, carrying extra weight while bleeding from multiple wounds that took strength and will beyond what most possessed. It took the kind of desperate determination that came from protecting something more valuable than your own life. He found her collapsed in the lee of a massive boulder, her body curled protectively around a bundle of furs that whimpered with small, weak sounds. She'd stopped moving maybe an hour ago, judging by the ice crystals forming on her exposed skin. Hypothermia had her in its grip now, that gentle killer that whispered you to sleep while stealing your life degree by degree. Another 20 minutes and she'd be past saving. The bundle she protected, whatever it was, would last even less. Kaelin approached slowly, assessing threats out of habit, even though nothing lived this high except him and the occasional snow leopard. The woman's face was battered, one eye swollen completely shut, her lips split and bleeding. Someone had beaten her with methodical precision, the kind of controlled violence that spoke of calculation rather than rage. Her ribs bore the distinctive bruise pattern of boot strikes. Professional brutality, executed by someone who knew exactly how much damage to inflict without quite killing. The bundle moved, and Kaelin's breath caught. Not one heartbeat, but three, small and fluttering like trapped birds. He knelt in the snow beside her and carefully peeled back the furs to reveal three tiny faces, newborns no more than a day old, their skin still wrinkled and red, their eyes barely open. Girls, all three, with the distinctive silver touch to their fur that marked them as something rare. The woman's eyes opened, the one that could, and found his face with surprising focus for someone so close to death. Her lips moved, forming words without sound, and he leaned closer to catch the whisper that barely qualified as breath. "My daughters, please." 2 words that changed everything. 2 words that shattered 200 years of isolation like glass against stone. Kaelin looked at the 3 helpless infants, at the woman who'd run herself to death trying to save them, and felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd thought dead and buried, something he'd spent 2 centuries trying to kill with distance and discipline and sheer stubborn will. Duty. The kind that couldn't be walked away from, that demanded response regardless of cost or consequence. He'd failed that duty once, spectacularly, and the guilt had driven him to this mountain exile. But here it was again, presented in the form of 3 newborns who'd done nothing to deserve freezing to death on a mountainside, protected by a warrior who'd given everything to get them this far. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate for moments like this, cheap currency that devalued the weight of the choice being made. Instead, he gathered the woman and her daughters into his arms, lifting them as carefully as he would carry explosives, and started back up the mountain toward the cave network that had been his home for longer than most wolves lived. The woman lost consciousness before they'd gone 100 yards. Better that way. The journey back required speed that would have been agony for someone aware, and Kaelin moved with the ground-eating lope of a predator in its prime, his body remembering rhythms older than civilization, his wolf rising close to the surface without quite breaking through. The mountain recognized him, had learned over 2 centuries that he belonged here, and the path opened before him in ways it never would for a stranger. His cave wasn't the rough shelter most would imagine. 200 years of occupation had transformed it into something closer to a fortress, with multiple chambers carved deeper into the mountain's bones, natural hot springs that provided warmth and water, stores of supplies that could last years if needed. He'd prepared this place to be his tomb, the final refuge where he could live out whatever remained of his centuries in peace. Now he carried 3 newborns and their dying mother across the threshold, and everything changed. The main chamber held the warmth of a carefully maintained fire, fed by a system of vents that drew fresh air from outside while channeling smoke through natural chimneys in the rock above. Kaelin laid the woman on the pile of furs that served as his bed, the first time another person had occupied that space in 200 years, and quickly stripped away her wet clothing. Hypothermia first, then the other injuries. Priorities learned from 1,000 battlefields reasserted themselves with automatic precision. He worked with the efficiency of long practice, wrapping her in dry furs, positioning her near the fire but not too close, monitoring her breathing and heart rate with senses that could detect the subtlest changes. The daughters he placed against her chest, skin to skin, their small bodies drawing warmth from their mother, even as she fought her way back from the edge of death. They'd been born premature by the look of them, underweight and fragile, but they had strong lungs and that silver-touched fur that suggested hidden reserves. While she slept, Kaelin examined her injuries with growing anger. The beating had been systematic, calculated to cause maximum pain without fatal damage. Ribs cracked but not broken, face bruised but bones intact, internal bleeding but nothing immediately life-threatening. Someone had known exactly what they were doing, had delivered this punishment with the precision of a craftsman. the kind of controlled violence that spoke of military training, of a soldier's discipline applied to domestic cruelty. Her hands, though, told a different story. Calluses and patterns he recognized, defensive wounds across her forearms, muscle development that came from weapons training. This woman was no helpless victim. She was a warrior in her own right, brought down not by inferior skill, but by overwhelming force and betrayal. The combination made him sick in ways that battlefield carnage never had. There was honor in combat between equals, a certain terrible beauty in the clash of matched opponents. This was just brutality dressed up as discipline. She woke at sunset, her good eye opening to find him sitting across the fire, maintaining the same motionless vigil he'd held for hours. For a long moment, neither spoke, taking each other's measure in the way of predators who've learned not to trust easily. She'd have questions, he knew, a dozen reasonable demands for explanation. But she surprised him by asking none of them. Instead, her hand moved to her chest, feeling for the warm weight of her daughters, and when she found them safe and breathing against her skin, she closed her eye again and let out a shaking breath that might have been a sob or a prayer or both. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice wrecked from screaming and the cold. Kaelin rose and moved to a small alcove where he kept his medical supplies, returning with water and a pouch of herbs that would help with pain and healing. He handed them to her without comment, settling back to his position across the fire. Close enough to help if needed, far enough to give her space to process whatever trauma had driven her to his mountain. She drank with the careful control of someone who understood hydration strategy, small sips rather than desperate gulps, letting her body adjust. When she finally spoke again, her voice was stronger, carrying the crisp authority of someone used to being obeyed. "This is Frostridge Hall, isn't it? The Forbidden Ridge. They tell stories about the warrior who lives here." Her good eye found his face and held it. "They say he's the first warlord, the one who walked away." Kaelin's jaw tightened. So his legend had survived, transformed into cautionary tale for children and idle speculation for those who'd never seen real war. They tell a lot of stories in the valleys, most of them wrong, but not that one. Not a question, a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who trusted her own assessment. "I studied your tactics in training, the defensive formations, the terrain exploitation, the way you integrated small unit actions into larger strategic movements. Whoever lives up here wrote half the doctrine they teach in warrior academies." Something flickered in his chest, an old pride he'd thought long dead stirring at the recognition. How many years since anyone had spoken to him about his work, about the theories and innovations that had once defined how civilized packs fought their wars? He crushed the feeling before it could take root, maintaining the careful distance that had kept him sane through 2 centuries of exile. That was a long time ago, different man, different world. She shifted, wincing as cracked ribs protested the movement, adjusting the bundle of daughters against her chest with automatic maternal care. "Maybe, but that man is the reason I came here. That man understands warriors. I hoped he might understand desperate ones." The statement hung between them, weighted with implications. Kaelin studied her more carefully now, noting details he'd missed in the urgency of saving her life. The patterns of her calluses suggested Eastern pack training, the aggressive offense-based style that prioritized speed and violence of action. Her posture, even injured and exhausted, maintained a defensive awareness that spoke of ingrained habit. She was evaluating exits, assessing threats, positioning herself to protect her young even here in relative safety. A warrior's mindset, never truly off duty. "Tell me what happened," he said, and it came out more command than request. She was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. Then the words came, flat and factual, the clinical recitation of an after-action report, stripped of emotion. "My mate is Theron, beta commander of Frostridge Pack's 3rd Battalion. We bonded 3 years ago, arranged marriage to cement alliance between Eastern and Northern territories. It was supposed to be political, but I thought we could make it work. I tried to be what they needed here." Her good eye fixed on the fire, watching flames dance across burning wood. "I was pregnant with twins. We thought twins anyway. Turns out it was triplets, but their heartbeats synced so perfectly, even the healers missed it." The daughters whimpered, small sounds of hunger or discomfort, and she shifted them against her chest, letting them root instinctively toward warmth. I went into labor during the worst blizzard in 50 years. The midwife said it was bad luck, but I think maybe it was blessing in disguise. Theron was out on maneuvers, not there to see me birth 3 daughters instead of sons. Her voice went harder, edges sharp enough to cut. Pack law says females are complications, drains on resources. I'd heard it said before but never believed it would apply to my children. Kalen felt cold settle into his bones that had nothing to do with mountain winter. He knew where this story was going, had seen variations of it play out across his too long life. Cultures that valued sons over daughters, that treated female children as burdens or bargaining chips, that reduced half their population to livestock with the capacity for speech. It was one of the corruptions he'd fought against in his time as warlord, one of the many failures that haunted him still. He came back that night, she continued, still staring at the fire with her one working eye. Took one look at the 3 of them, and his face went cold. Not angry, which would have been better somehow. Just cold, calculating, like he was doing mathematics about resource allocation and risk assessment. She paused, swallowing hard, and Kalen saw her hand tremble slightly before she forced it steady. He said he could sell them to the border kingdoms. They buy females young, raise them to be whatever they need. Or he could take care of the problem more permanently. The fire popped, sending sparks swirling upward. Kalen watched them rise and die like small red stars. "So you ran." "I tactical retreated," she corrected with a flash of something that might have been pride or defiance, or both. "There's a difference. Running is panic. Retreating is strategy. I waited until morning shift change, took what supplies I could carry without raising alarm, created a false trail toward the eastern passes, then doubled back and made for the Forbidden Ridge. I knew the stories. Knew that if the First Warlord still lived up here, he might understand that warriors protect warriors, regardless of what's between their legs or how old they are." She finally looked away from the fire, meeting his gaze with the kind of direct challenge that would have earned her a beating in traditional pack hierarchy. "So here I am, bleeding on your floor with 3 daughters who are supposed to be mistakes, hoping the legend is true. Hoping that somewhere under 200 years of isolation, there's still a man who remembers what honor actually means." The words hit like artillery fire, precision strikes against defenses he'd thought impregnable. Kalen stood abruptly, needing distance, needing to move before the walls closed in. He walked to the cave entrance, staring out at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. Behind him, the woman and her daughters waited for a response he didn't know how to give. Honor. She'd said it like an accusation, like a challenge, like a prayer. What did he know about honor anymore? He'd abandoned his people when they needed him most, walked away from responsibility because the weight of his failures had become too heavy to carry. He'd spent 2 centuries hiding on this mountain, maintaining weapons skills for battles he refused to fight, preparing for wars he'd never join. What honor was there in that? But then he thought about the 3 tiny lives sleeping against their mother's chest, innocent of all crimes except being born the wrong gender to the wrong male at the wrong time. He thought about a warrior woman who'd run herself to near death protecting them, who'd made it 3 miles through mountain winter on sheer determination and tactical thinking. He thought about Theron, whoever he was, a soldier who'd let the brutality of his profession bleed into his personal life until he could contemplate murdering his own children as a matter of resource management. The mountain wind carried the scent of snow and stone and the vast emptiness of high places. For 200 years, this had been enough. The discipline, the routine, the careful construction of a life bounded by the simple needs of survival. But standing here now, knowing what he knew, aware of what was being asked of him, Kalen felt the foundations of that carefully built isolation beginning to crack. "You can stay," he heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious decision. "You and your daughters, until you heal, until it's safe. I'll make sure no one finds you here." Behind him, he heard her breath catch, heard the small sound that might have been gratitude or relief, or simply the release of tension that had been holding her together through impossible circumstances. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words carried weight beyond simple courtesy. Kalen didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the darkening sky, watching the stars emerge one by one from the deepening blue. He'd broken his isolation, cracked open the door he'd sealed shut 2 centuries ago. There would be consequences. There always were. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something besides guilt and regret stirring in his chest. It felt dangerously close to purpose. The days that followed fell into patterns dictated by necessity. The woman, who'd finally told him her name was Alara, healed with the stubborn resilience of someone who refused to accept weakness. Her ribs knitted slowly, the bruises on her face fading through spectacular colors before disappearing entirely. She moved through the cave with increasing confidence, learning its rhythms, respecting its boundaries, maintaining the careful distance between them that neither acknowledged but both understood. Her daughters thrived in ways that surprised him. Newborns were fragile things normally, requiring constant attention and care. But these three, Senna and Sable and little Lyric with her distinctive silver-marked fur, showed the kind of vitality that suggested hidden strength. They fed well when Alara had milk, slept peacefully when they didn't, and only cried when something was genuinely wrong. Even to his inexperienced eyes, they seemed unusually alert, tracking movement earlier than normal, responding to sounds with a focus that spoke of intelligence beyond their days. He caught Alara watching him watch them once, a slight smile on her healing face. "They like you," she said. "Lyric especially. See how she turns toward you when you enter the room? She knows your scent already." Kaelin had no response to that, uncomfortable with the implications. He'd never had children of his own, never bonded deeply enough with anyone to contemplate that kind of future. His life had been warfare and tactics, command decisions and strategic calculations, the endless chess game of conflict played out across territories and centuries. Children were vulnerabilities, attachments that could be exploited, complications that no professional soldier needed. But watching Lyric's small face turn toward him, her eyes struggling to focus on his features, he felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with tactical assessment or strategic thinking. It was simpler and more dangerous than that. It was care, raw and undefended, the kind of investment in another life that made you vulnerable to the worst kinds of pain. On the 5th day, Alara asked him to train her. He'd been running through sword forms in the outer chamber, the familiar movements grounding him in routine when everything else felt unstable. She appeared in the entrance, watching him with the kind of focused attention he recognized from soldiers studying their instructors. "No," he said without breaking rhythm. "You're still healing. My ribs are cracked, not broken. I can work around that." She moved into the space with him, taking a position that mirrored his stance. "I've been sedentary for almost a week. My body's going soft. Your body nearly died of exposure. It needs rest." "What it needs," she said, her voice carrying an edge now, "is to be ready for when he comes looking." That stopped him mid-form. Kaelin lowered his practice sword and turned to face her fully. "You think he will?" "I know he will." She maintained her stance, back straight, feet positioned, shoulders set. Theron is a decorated combat veteran. 3 tours on the border, 2 Valor commendations, promotion track toward battalion command. He doesn't leave loose ends, and right now I'm the loosest end possible. The question isn't if he comes. It's when, and whether I'm ready when he does. The analysis was sound, delivered with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that impressed him despite himself. She'd thought this through, mapped the probabilities, understood the threat profile. Most people in her situation would be focused on immediate survival, on getting through one day to the next. She was already planning for the inevitable confrontation, already preparing herself for what would come. "You can't beat him," Kaelin said flatly. "Not straight up. Even if you were at full strength, which you're not. You told me he's battalion commander level. That means hundreds of combat engagements, kill count in the dozens, tactical expertise refined through actual warfare. You're good. I can see that. But good doesn't beat great when great is willing to kill you." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "Then teach me how to fight someone better than me. That's what tactical doctrine is for, right? Leveraging advantages to overcome superior opposition. You wrote half the book on asymmetric warfare. Teach me how to apply it." He should have refused. Every instinct screamed that getting more involved was a mistake, that training her meant investment, meant commitment, meant caring about whether she lived or died when he'd spent 2 centuries specifically not caring about anything beyond his own isolated existence. But he looked at her standing there, battered but unbowed, asking not for rescue but for the tools to rescue herself, and found his resistance crumbling. "Fine," he said, tossing her a practice sword. "Show me what you know." She caught it cleanly, testing the weight and balance with automatic competence, then moved into an opening stance he recognized from Eastern Pact doctrine. Aggressive, forward-weighted, built around explosive offense and overwhelming force. Good for raids, ambush scenarios, situations where speed and violence of action could carry the day. They circled each other in the careful dance of warriors assessing threats. Kaelin watched how she moved, noting the slight favor of her left side where the ribs were worst, the way she kept her right elbow in tight to protect damaged kidney, the micro-adjustments that turned weaknesses into controlled variables. She'd been trained well, whoever her instructors were, trained by people who understood that warfare was about managing limitations as much as exploiting strengths. She struck first, a testing probe toward his center line that he deflected almost lazily. She flowed into a second strike, then a third, building a rhythm of attack that would have overwhelmed a less experienced opponent. But Kaelin had been fighting since before her grandmother was born. He read the pattern in her first 3 movements, predicted the 4th and 5th, and when she committed to what should have been a decisive combination, he simply wasn't there. His counterstrike came from an angle she hadn't anticipated, wooden blades stopping a hair's breadth from her exposed throat. She froze, chest heaving, eyes wide with the recognition of how completely she'd been outmaneuvered. "You're aggressive," he said, lowering the practice sword. "That's good in some situations, but aggression without adaptability is just suicide with extra steps. You committed to an attack sequence before you confirmed it would work. I gave you 3 chances to read that I was baiting you, and you missed all of them." She nodded slowly, processing the lesson without deflecting or making excuses. Another point in her favor. "Show me," she said. So he did. For the next hour, Kaelin walked her through the fundamentals of defensive warfare, the patient predator's approach to combat, how to read an opponent's tells, how to conserve energy while forcing them to spend theirs, how to turn aggression into a weapon against itself. She absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every lesson might be the difference between life and death. When they finally stopped, both breathing hard, Kaelin found himself studying her with something approaching respect. She'd kept up despite her injuries, pushed through pain without complaint, maintained focus even when exhaustion made her movements sloppy. That kind of determination couldn't be taught. You either had it or you didn't, and she had it in abundance. "You'll never beat him head to head," he said, passing her a water skin. "But you don't have to. You just have to survive long enough for him to make a mistake, then capitalize on it. That's the real lesson of asymmetric warfare. Superior force can be defeated by inferior force that refuses to fight on superior force's terms." She drank deeply, then met his eyes with a directness that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "And if he brings help? Other soldiers from his unit? Then you use terrain, create choke points, force them into situations where numbers become a liability instead of an advantage." He paused, considering. "Or you ensure you're not alone either." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. If Theron came with backup, she'd need backup of her own. And right now, on this isolated mountain, there was only one person who could provide it. On the 7th day, they heard the howl. It echoed up from the valleys below, carrying across miles of mountain terrain with the clarity that only a wolf's throat could produce. Not a wild animal's call, but something more structured, more purposeful. A challenge, an announcement, a promise of violence delivered on notes that made the air itself seem to vibrate with threat. Alara went pale, her good eye widening. "That's Theron." Kaelin moved to the cave entrance, his enhanced senses reaching down the mountain, mapping the threat. Not just one wolf. He counted heartbeats, separated individual scents, constructed a tactical picture from information most would never perceive. 6 wolves, moving in coordinated formation. Professional military approach with scouts forward and main body following at disciplined intervals. "He brought a fire team," Kaelin said, his voice flat with the calm that came before battle. "Standard small unit tactics, scouting element to map terrain and locate targets, assault element to execute, command element to coordinate. Your mate learned his lessons well." Behind him, he heard Alara's sharp intake of breath. "Can we run? There's got to be other ways down the mountain." "There are." He turned back to face her, and something in his expression made her go still. But running means he follows, and eventually he catches you in terrain that favors him instead of me. Better to fight here, on ground I know, in conditions I've prepared for. He paused, letting the weight of what he was about to say settle into place. Better to fight now, while you have help. She stared at him for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're going to fight them. 6 combat veterans, and you're going to fight them. Why? It was a fair question, deserving an honest answer. Kaelin looked past her to where the 3 daughters slept in their nest of furs, innocent and oblivious to the violence descending on them. He thought about 200 years of isolation, of careful distance, of refusing to engage with a world that had disappointed him too many times. He thought about honor and duty, and all the complicated ways those concepts could be twisted into justifications for either action or inaction. Because some lines can't be crossed without response, he finally said. Because warriors protect warriors, and you're a warrior whether your mate recognizes it or not, and because those 3 small lives deserve better than to be hunted down and murdered for the crime of being born female. He moved toward the weapon cache he maintained in the cave's deeper chambers. But mostly because I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending that isolation is the same thing as peace. The howl came again, closer this time, and Kaelin felt his wolf stir beneath his skin. It had been 200 years since he'd shifted, since he'd let the predator out to do what predators did best. But the body remembered, the instincts rising like muscle memory, ancient and sure, and utterly without mercy. "Stay inside," he told Alara, his voice already beginning to roughen with the change. "Protect your daughters. Whatever you hear out there, whatever happens, you stay inside until I come back." "And if you don't come back?" He smiled then, an expression with nothing warm in it, all edges and violence barely contained. "Then you take the eastern passage I showed you, move fast and quiet, and you pray they don't have trackers good enough to follow through the deep canyon system." He pulled on combat harness, checking weapons placement with automatic precision. "But I will come back. I've been fighting since before their grandparents were born, and I wrote most of the tactical doctrine they're probably using. They're good. I'm better." The transformation took him then, bones reshaping, muscle redistributing, his human form compressing and expanding simultaneously into something larger, something older, something that had walked battlefields when the world was young and wolves knew what they were. His fur was silver shot through with black, his eyes the distinctive amber gold of ancient bloodlines, his size easily twice that of a normal wolf. The First Warlord, they'd called him, the warrior who'd unified the packs, who'd written the doctrines of civilized warfare, who'd walked away from it all when the cost became too high. But tonight, standing in the entrance of his cave with the scent of approaching enemies on the wind, Kaelin remembered what he'd been before the guilt, before the isolation, before the long years of self-imposed exile. Tonight, he remembered what it meant to fight for something that mattered. He moved out into the darkness, into the snow, into the coming battle with the smooth, predatory grace of something that had never forgotten how to kill. Behind him, in the warmth of the cave, Alara gathered her daughters close and waited for the sounds of war to begin. The fire team approached with textbook precision, and Kaelin marked them from positions they'd never suspect. They'd trained for mountain warfare, but never against someone who'd lived on this mountain for 2 centuries. Every rock, every ice formation, every subtle shift in terrain that could advantage or betray, he knew them all with the intimacy of long familiarity. This was his ground, consecrated by years of solitary patrol, and they were intruders who'd brought violence to his sanctuary. The scouts came first, 2 wolves moving in overlapping coverage patterns, each watching sectors the other couldn't observe. Good tactical thinking, the kind that kept professional soldiers alive through multiple deployments. But they were watching for threats at ground level, scanning for defensive positions that made tactical sense, and they missed entirely the possibility of someone crouched on the ice shelf 10 feet above their heads. Kaelin dropped between them like judgment from above, his weight and momentum carrying them down into snow that suddenly became a weapon. He'd chosen this spot specifically, knowing the drift concealed jagged rocks just below the surface. The first scout hit badly, leg breaking with an audible crack, his yelp of pain cut short as Kaelin's jaws found his throat. Not a killing bite, not yet, just enough pressure to ensure silence and compliance. The second scout reacted with the trained reflexes of a combat veteran, rolling away from the initial impact, coming up in defensive position, jaws open for the howl that would alert the main body. Kalen was faster. A paw strike to the side of the head, calculated force, stunning without killing, and the scout went down hard. Two neutralized in less than 10 seconds, and the main body still unaware that their forward element had been eliminated. He dragged both scouts behind a rock formation, binding them quickly with leather strips he'd prepared earlier. They'd live, probably keep their limbs if they didn't struggle too much, but they were out of the fight. That left 4 wolves in the main assault element, and one of them would be Theron. Time to make the odds a little more even. The trap he'd set 3 days ago, back when some part of him had known this confrontation was inevitable, activated with perfect timing. A rope pulled taut by weight distribution, releasing a carefully balanced load of snow and rock that came down the mountainside with the force of an avalanche. Not enough to kill anyone who knew what they were doing, but enough to scatter the formation, separate the wolves from each other, turn their coordinated assault into a confused scramble for survival. Kalen moved through the chaos like a ghost, striking from angles they couldn't predict, using the terrain he knew by heart against enemies who'd never seen this ground before. A wolf emerged from the snow cloud, and he was on it instantly, combat harness allowing him to carry weapons even in wolf form. The blade took the warrior across the shoulder, deep enough to disable the limb without severing arteries, dropping him into the snow with a howl of pain and surprise. 3 left now, and they were adapting, forming a defensive triangle, covering each other's approaches in the kind of automatic coordination that came from training together through multiple deployments. Kalen watched from concealment, assessing. The wolf on the left was older, moving with the caution of someone who'd survived by not taking unnecessary risks. The one on the right was younger, aggressive, looking for targets with the barely contained violence of someone who wanted to prove himself. And the one in the center, largest of the 3, moving with the controlled power of someone who'd commanded others through real combat. Theron. Had to be. The size, the bearing, the way the other 2 unconsciously deferred to his positioning. Kalen had seen 1,000 commanders in his time, and they all carried themselves with that same distinctive authority. This was the male who'd beaten Alara, who'd threatened to murder his own daughters, who'd brought a military assault team to hunt down his fleeing mate. This was the enemy that mattered. Their eyes met across 30 feet of snow-swept mountainside. Predator recognizing predator, warrior acknowledging warrior. For a moment, everything was still. Then Theron's lips pulled back in a snarl that exposed teeth meant for rending flesh, and he charged with the kind of focused violence that had probably carried him through a dozen battles successfully. It would have worked against most opponents, the direct assault, overwhelming force, relying on size and strength and ferocity to break through defensive positions. But Kalen hadn't survived 342 years by fighting fair or engaging on his opponent's terms. He waited until Theron committed fully to the charge, until momentum made changing direction impossible. Then he simply stepped aside and let the younger wolf's own aggression carry him past and off balance. The counterstrike was textbook, exactly the kind of movement he'd spent the morning teaching Alara. Turn the opponent's strength into weakness, use their commitment against them, strike where they've left themselves vulnerable in the act of attacking. His blade opened a long gash across Theron's ribs, not deep enough to kill, but painful enough to slow, bleeding enough to weaken over time. Theron recovered with impressive speed, spinning to face him again, more cautious now, recognizing that this wouldn't be the easy hunt he'd anticipated. The other 2 wolves moved to flank, trying to establish the kind of multiple angle assault that Kalen's defensive doctrine had been specifically designed to counter. He gave ground deliberately, drawing them toward terrain that looked favorable but concealed his next prepared position. The fight that followed was brutal and efficient, the kind of combat that professional soldiers would recognize and civilians would never understand. No dramatic flourishes, no wasted movement, just the grim mathematics of tactical violence executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Kaelin's centuries of experience against their years of training, his intimate knowledge of terrain against their numerical advantage, the patient predator against the aggressive hunters. He bled them by degrees, small cuts that accumulated into serious problems, forcing them to divide attention between pressing their attack and managing their wounds. The younger wolf went down first, overeager and underdisciplined, catching a blade strike that severed tendons in his hind leg. Not fatal, but fight-ending, leaving him crawling through snow towards safety that was too far away. The older wolf proved tougher, adapting his tactics, recognizing that Kaelin was using the mountain itself as a weapon. They fought across ice sheets and around rock formations, trading strikes that would have killed lesser warriors, both bleeding now, both knowing that victory would go to whoever could maintain focus through pain and exhaustion. It ended when the wolf's foot found a patch of ice Kaelin had deliberately left exposed, his balance betraying him for just a moment. And in that moment, Kaelin was inside his guard with steel, finding the vulnerable junction of neck and shoulder. The wolf went down hard, not dead, but finished, breathing wet and labored through a partially collapsed lung. That left Theron, standing alone now in the snow, his assault team scattered and broken around him. He should have retreated, should have recognized the engagement was lost and withdrawn to preserve what remained of his forces. But commanders who'd never lost before rarely knew when to stop fighting, and Theron charged again with the desperate fury of someone who couldn't accept defeat. They met in the center of carnage, two warriors with nothing held back, everything committed. Theron fought with the brutal efficiency of military training, combinations and sequences practiced 10,000 times until they became automatic. Kaelin fought with the terrible economy of someone who'd been refining his art since before Theron's culture existed, every movement containing centuries of accumulated knowledge. It wasn't close. For all his decorations and commendations, for all his combat experience and professional training, Theron was fighting someone who'd been ancient when the codes Theron followed were still being written. Kaelin broke down his defenses systematically, exposing weaknesses, exploiting overcommitments, staying just outside the range where Theron's greater aggression could overcome technical superiority. The end came when Theron threw everything into a final all-out assault, recognizing that caution had failed him, and only desperate violence remained. Kaelin met the charge head-on, accepting impacts that would have crippled normal wolves, his ancient body absorbing punishment that should have been impossible, and then his jaws closed on Theron's throat with the measured force of absolute control. Not a killing bite, not yet. Just enough pressure to communicate that death was available if Kaelin chose to deliver it. They stood there in the snow, locked together, predator and prey, victor and vanquished, while blood dripped from a dozen wounds on both their bodies and the mountain wind howled approval or condemnation around them. Kaelin released him slowly, stepping back, maintaining eye contact in the way of dominant wolves establishing hierarchy. Theron collapsed into the snow, breathing hard, defeated in every way that mattered. Around them, the remains of his assault team lay scattered and broken, alive but combat ineffective, their professional military operation reduced to disaster by one old warrior who'd known this mountain better than they ever could. "Leave," Kaelin said, his voice rough with the change but understandable. "Take your wounded and leave. Tell whoever sent you that this mountain is under my protection now. Anyone who comes here hunting what's mine will meet the same fate." Theron's eyes held rage and humiliation, and the bitter knowledge of absolute defeat. But beneath it, Kaelin saw something else. Respect, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement. This was a warrior who understood that he'd been beaten by someone better, who could recognize superior skill even through the pain of his own failure. "This isn't over," Theron managed through his damaged throat. "The council will hear about this. The war leader will respond." "Let them." Kaelin turned away, dismissing him in the way calculated to sting most. "I broke your assault team without killing a single one of you. Tell your war leader that. Tell him that the First Warlord is back, and he remembers every lesson he ever taught. Then tell him to send better soldiers next time, or don't send anyone at all." He walked back towards his cave, leaving Theron to gather his broken team, to treat their wounds, to retreat from the mountain with the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. Behind him, he heard the sounds of soldiers helping each other, of warriors recognizing that they'd lived through this but would carry the memory forever. Alara met him at the cave entrance, her face pale but her eyes clear and calm. She'd heard everything, had listened to the sounds of battle with the trained ear of someone who understood combat, had waited in the darkness with her daughters while outside her mate was beaten into submission. Now she looked at Kaelin, taking in his wounds, the blood matting his fur, the exhaustion that came after sustained violence, and something complicated crossed her expression. "You didn't kill him," she said. "No." Kaelin shifted back to human form, the transformation leaving him shaking with the effort it required. Killing him would have solved nothing. This way, he goes back with a message. This way, everyone knows that you're under my protection, that these 3 daughters have a guardian who won't permit them to be threatened. He met her eyes, needing her to understand. This way, there's a chance that the next confrontation can be avoided instead of escalated. She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you. For the second time, thank you for my life and theirs. Don't thank me yet." Kaelin moved past her into the cave, suddenly aware of how much his wounds hurt, how exhausted the fight had left him, how the adrenaline was fading into the crash that always followed combat. "I just made us both targets. The Council won't ignore this. When Theron delivers his report, they'll know I'm back, and that means everything I've avoided for 200 years is about to find me again." In the depths of the cave, the 3 daughters slept peacefully, unaware that their very existence had just started something that couldn't be stopped, that the simple act of their mother fleeing with them had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape everything. Kaelin looked at their small, peaceful faces and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like armor he'd thought he'd put aside forever. For 200 years, he'd kept his vow of isolation. Now, for 3 newborn daughters and their warrior mother, he'd broken it. The question that remained was what would rise from those broken pieces, and whether the world was ready for the first warlord to remember what he'd been before guilt and grief had driven him to exile. Outside, the mountain wind carried the sounds of Theron's broken team retreating down the slopes, and somewhere in the valleys below, the Council was about to learn that the warrior they'd thought safely neutralized by his own conscience had found something worth fighting for again. The siege was coming. Kaelin could feel it in his bones, in the way the air tasted, in the subtle shifts of political currents that he'd learned to read over centuries of warfare. He'd fired the first shot by defeating Theron's assault team, and now the response would come. Not immediately, not with the kind of reckless haste that got soldiers killed, but with the methodical planning and overwhelming force that professional militaries brought to bear when they wanted something eliminated. He had time, though. Days, maybe weeks if they were bureaucratic enough. Time to prepare, time to heal, time to train Alara into something more than a fleeing victim. Time to turn his isolated sanctuary into the fortress it had always had the potential to become. And time, perhaps most importantly, to figure out what exactly he was fighting for beyond the simple imperative of protecting 3 innocent lives. Because somewhere in the past 7 days, between finding a dying woman in the snow and breaking a military assault team against his mountain, Kaelin had stopped running from his past and started building toward a future he couldn't quite see yet. The daughters would grow, Alara would heal and train and become the warrior she'd always had the potential to be, and he, after 200 years of isolation and self-imposed exile, would remember what it meant to stand for something beyond his own tortured conscience. The war was coming. But this time, for the first time in 2 centuries, Kaelin was ready. The messenger arrived at Council headquarters 3 days after Theron's broken team limped back into Frostridge territory. He was young, maybe 20 winters, still carrying the nervous energy of someone who hadn't seen enough combat to understand that fear was just another tactical variable to be managed. He stood before the War Council with shoulders squared and voice steady, delivering his report with the crisp precision that suggested good training and better discipline. Declan listened without interruption, his 420 years of experience teaching him that the first report was always incomplete, always filtered through the perspective of whoever survived to tell it. Around the council table, 6 other senior commanders maintained their own silence, each processing the implications through their particular lens of expertise. When the messenger finished, Declan dismissed him with a gesture and waited until the door closed before speaking. 6 warriors, he said, his voice carrying the kind of flat effect that came from delivering bad news so many times it had stopped carrying emotional weight. 6 of our best, equipped for mountain warfare, moving in proper tactical formation, and 1 old wolf defeated them without killing a single one. He looked around the table, meeting each commander's eyes in turn. Thoughts? Commander Voss, oldest of the group and veteran of border campaigns that predated most of their service records, spoke first. If the report is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt young Garrett's assessment, then we're dealing with someone operating at a level we haven't seen in generations. The tactical approach described, using terrain as a weapon, separating units through environmental manipulation, neutralizing threats without fatal force, that's textbook doctrine from the old wars, from before pack consolidation, from before we forgot what real warfare looked like, Declan agreed. He stood, moving to the map table that dominated the center of the room, his finger tracing the mountain ridge where Kaelin had made his stand. The question isn't whether this is the First Warlord. The question is what we do about it. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. Because if he's back, if he's actively engaging again, then everything we've built over the past 2 centuries becomes vulnerable. Commander Lissa, younger than Voss, but carrying scars that suggested extensive combat experience, leaned forward. Vulnerable how? He's 1 wolf. Ancient, yes. Skilled, obviously. But still just 1 against our entire military structure. He wrote that structure, Voss said quietly. The doctrine we teach, the tactics we employ, the strategic frameworks we use to plan campaigns, he developed most of it. Fighting him using his own innovations is like trying to beat a master at chess when he invented half the moves, you know. Declan nodded, appreciating that someone understood the scope of the problem. Moreover, his presence represents something more dangerous than military threat. He represents legitimacy. For 200 years, we've maintained that our approach, our hierarchy, our methods were the only viable path forward, that females in combat roles were liabilities, that rigid command structure was necessary for survival, that individual concerns had to be subordinated to collective security. He traced another line on the map, this one showing the border with enemy kingdoms. Now the 1 wolf who originally argued for more flexible approaches, who advocated for merit-based promotion regardless of gender, who pushed for decentralized command and trust in subordinates, that wolf has returned. And his first act was to defeat 6 of our warriors while protecting a female and her daughters that we'd classified as expendable. The implications rippled through the room like stones dropped in still water. Commander Lissa's expression went from skeptical to troubled. So this isn't about 1 fight on a mountain. This is about what that fight represents. Exactly. Declan returned to his seat, suddenly looking every one of his 4 centuries. We've been preparing for border invasion for 50 years, stockpiling resources, implementing strict rationing, enforcing unity through authoritarian measures, all necessary, I believed, to ensure survival when the kingdoms finally mobilize. He paused, and something that might have been regret flickered across his features before being suppressed. But in the process, we've created a culture that sees compassion as weakness, that treats half our population as second tier, that responds to dissent with force rather than dialogue. Kaelin walked away from us because he saw where we were heading. Now he's back, and I have to ask myself if everything I've done was necessary caution or just convenient cruelty. The silence that followed was profound. These were warriors who'd spent lifetimes following Declan's leadership, implementing his policies, enforcing his vision. Hearing him question himself was like watching a mountain express doubt about being made of stone. Finally, Commander Voss spoke. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we bring overwhelming force," Declan said, but his voice carried none of the usual certainty. 50 warriors, full battalion strength, siege equipment, supply lines for extended operation. We surround his position, cut off escape routes, and force negotiation from a position of strength. He looked around the table. But I'm also proposing we actually negotiate, that we listen to what he has to say. Because if our policies have become so rigid that the warrior who founded our civilization can't operate within them, maybe the problem isn't him. 3 days later, the battalion assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. 50 wolves, each a combat veteran with at least 3 campaigns under their belt, checking equipment and reviewing assignments with the kind of methodical professionalism that separated trained soldiers from armed civilians. Theron stood among them, his wounds from the mountains still visible, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body hadn't quite forgiven the beating it had received. Garrett found him as the sun crested the eastern peaks, bringing coffee that steamed in the cold air and settling beside him without invitation. They'd been fireteam partners for 5 years, had saved each other's lives often enough that the debt couldn't be calculated, had the kind of friendship that only forms between people who've shared foxholes and fear in equal measure. "You don't have to go," Garrett said without preamble. "Declan would understand. You're still healing." Theron shook his head, accepting the coffee and wrapping his hands around its warmth. "I have to be there. This started with me, with my failure to control my own household. If there's fighting, I need to be part of it. If there's negotiation, I need to face what I did." He paused, staring at the steam rising from his cup. "I beat my mate, Garrett. Beat her badly enough that she'd rather risk death by exposure than stay another day under my roof. Then I brought professional soldiers to hunt her down like a criminal. And when we got there, an old wolf who owed us nothing defeated all of us while protecting what I should have protected from the beginning. War did that to you," Garrett said quietly. "The things we saw in the border campaigns, the things we had to do, they change people. You're not the only one struggling. That's not an excuse." Theron's voice carried an edge now, sharpened by something that might have been self-loathing, or might have been the first stirrings of genuine self-awareness. "Plenty of warriors see combat and don't become wife-beaters. Plenty of soldiers carry trauma without transferring it to innocence. I made choices, and they were wrong, and now I have to live with that." He looked at Garrett directly. "The question is what I do next. Do I double down, try to justify what can't be justified, or do I admit I became something I never wanted to be and try to find a way back?" Before Garrett could respond, the order came down to move out. 50 wolves flowing into formation, supplies distributed, roles assigned, the well-oiled machine of military organization executing with practiced efficiency. They moved north toward the mountains with the steady pace of professionals who understood that warfare was marathon rather than sprint. That victory went to those who could maintain discipline and cohesion over extended operations. Declan commanded from the center, his position allowing him to coordinate forward elements and rear security simultaneously. Theron found himself assigned to the second wave assault team, close enough to the action if things went violent, but not in the initial contact position. Garrett, skilled in communications and signals, stayed near Declan as part of the command element. It was textbook deployment, the kind they'd executed dozens of times in training and real operations both. What none of them expected was how thoroughly Kaelin had prepared. The first indication came when their scouts reported finding prepared positions. Not hasty fighting holes dug in panic, but carefully constructed defensive works that suggested someone had been planning for this possibility long before Theron's ill-fated assault. Overlapping fields of fire, fallback positions with covered approaches, supply caches positioned to support extended defense. The kind of preparation that required military expertise and intimate terrain knowledge. "He knew we'd come," Declan said, studying the scout reports with growing unease. "Probably knew the moment Theron left that first time, which means he's had a week to turn that mountain into a fortress." Commander Voss, serving as tactical advisor for this operation, traced potential approach routes on the map. "Every avenue we take puts us at disadvantage. He'll see us coming, can harass our advance with minimal risk, force us to move through terrain where our numbers become liability rather than advantage. It's beautiful, in a terrible sort of way. This is what we'd do if we were defending against superior force." "Because he taught us how," Declan finished. He stared at the mountain rising before them, suddenly looking less like terrain and more like a living adversary. "All right, we're not taking casualties on a forced assault. Deploy siege positions, establish perimeter, cut off any escape routes. If he wants to stay up there, we'll wait him out. Sooner or later, supplies run low or the female gets desperate, or those daughters need something he can't provide. Then we negotiate." The siege began with the kind of careful preparation that characterized professional military operations. 50 wolves establishing positions that surrounded the mountain's accessible approaches, supply lines running back to Frost Ridge territory, rotation schedules ensuring fresh warriors at every position. It was exhausting, boring work, the kind that tested discipline more than courage, that required patience instead of heroism. On the third day, Kaelin sent a message. Not through messenger or signal, but through action. A precisely placed rockfall that came down on one of their forward positions, calculated to destroy supplies without injuring the wolves there. The timing was perfect, executing during shift change when the position was occupied, but everyone was distracted. The message was clear. I can hurt you whenever I choose. I'm showing restraint. Declan read that message correctly and responded in kind, pulling back the most aggressive positions, easing the perimeter just enough to signal that he understood the communication. It became a strange dance, two commanders with professional respect for each other's capabilities, engaging in a careful dialogue conducted through military action and tactical restraint. On the fifth day, something changed. Garrett had been assigned to night watch on the eastern perimeter, a position that offered a view of the mountain's lower approaches. He saw movement where there shouldn't be any, tracked it with the careful attention of someone whose survival had often depended on noticing what didn't belong, and recognized the profile. Theron moving away from their lines, heading up the mountain alone. For a moment, Garrett considered raising the alarm. This was desertion, abandonment of post, the kind of action that got soldiers executed in field conditions. But something about Theron's movements, the careful deliberation rather than furtive haste, suggested this wasn't flight. This was purpose. Garrett made a decision that would change everything and let him go. Theron climbed with his wounds protesting every step, the mountain cold cutting through his combat gear, his breath coming in white plumes that seemed too loud in the pre-dawn darkness. He knew this was probably stupid, definitely against orders, and quite possibly the last mistake he'd ever make. But something had broken inside him during that first defeat, some fundamental piece of his identity that had been holding him together through all the years of violence and trauma. He'd become a monster. Not suddenly, not through one dramatic choice, but gradually, degree by degree, compromise by compromise. The border wars had shown him what fear looked like, what desperation drove people to do. He'd learned that mercy got soldiers killed, that compassion was exploitable weakness, that the only way to survive was to be harder and colder than whatever you faced. And somewhere in that process, he'd stopped being the man who'd bonded with Alara because her warrior spirit matched his own and become something she'd had to flee from to protect their children. The cave entrance loomed ahead, a deeper darkness against the mountain's black face. Theron stopped at the threshold, going deliberately to his knees, exposing his throat in the universal gesture of submission. It might be the last thing he did. The old wolf had shown restraint before, but walking into his territory uninvited was a provocation that could justly be met with lethal force. "I know you can hear me," Theron said, his voice carrying into the darkness. "I know you're watching. I came alone, unarmed, to claim warriors' right to parley." He paused, swallowing hard. "I wronged your mate. I wronged my daughters. I wronged everything I once believed about honor and duty. I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to face what I've done, to offer atonement through service if you'll accept it, or to accept judgment if that's what's deserved." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Kaelin emerged from the shadows, still in human form, moving with that liquid grace that suggested the wolf was never more than a thought away. He studied Theron with eyes that had witnessed centuries of warriors claiming regret, evaluating whether this was genuine remorse or tactical manipulation. "Your commander is waiting for you to scout our defenses," Kaelin said. "Report back that we're well supplied, well positioned, and not going anywhere. Tell him that if he wants negotiation, he sends someone with authority to make binding agreements, not assault teams." "I'm not going back." The words came out flat, final. "I deserted my post. That's execution offense in field conditions. I know that, accepted it when I started climbing." Theron met Kaelin's eyes, and something raw showed through. "I'm 35 years old. I've served in 3 border campaigns, killed 17 enemy combatants in direct action, earned 2 valor commendations. I've been a professional soldier since I was 16. And I used all that training, all that skill, all that discipline to beat my mate, because she gave me daughters instead of sons." His voice cracked. "What kind of warrior does that make me?" "A broken one," Kaelin said, but not without sympathy. "War breaks people in different ways. Some fracture inward, harm themselves trying to process trauma. Others fracture outward, harm those around them because it's easier than facing what the trauma did to them." He gestured toward the cave entrance. "Come inside. If I'm going to pass judgment, it shouldn't be in the cold." The cave's interior was warmer than Theron expected, heated by thermal springs and a carefully maintained fire. Elara was there, tending to her daughters, and when she looked up and saw him, her whole body went rigid with tension that wasn't quite fear, but certainly wasn't welcome. "He came seeking parley," Kaelin said before the situation could escalate. "Unarmed, knowing it might be suicide. I'm granting him that much courtesy." Elara's eye, the one that could see clearly, studied Theron with an expression he couldn't read. Not hate, which he'd expected, not fear, which he'd earned. Something more complicated, more measured. The look of a warrior assessing whether an enemy could be turned into an ally or whether elimination remained the only option. "Say what you came to say," she finally said, her voice carrying none of the warmth it once had, but also none of the terror from that last night. "Then I'll decide whether you leave here walking or carried." So Theron talked about the border wars, about the things he'd seen and done, about the slow erosion of the man he'd thought himself to be, about how military discipline and tactical thinking had bled into his personal life until he'd started treating his mate like a subordinate and his children like mission objectives, about the moment when he'd looked at 3 newborn daughters and felt nothing but cold calculation about resource allocation and risk assessment. "I can't undo what I did," he said, and his voice was raw now, stripped of military bearing and professional composure. "I can't take back the fear I put in you, the pain I caused, the violence that drove you to choose death by exposure over one more day in my presence, but I can offer service. Ancient law allows for atonement debt, for warriors who've wronged others to offer years of their life in protection and service." He turned to Kaelin. "If you'll accept it, I offer myself as oath-bound guardian for those daughters until they reach maturity. My life for theirs, my sword for their protection, my service for whatever you require." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the daughters seemed to sense the weight of the moment, their small sounds stilling to silence. Kaelin and Elara exchanged a look that carried layers of communication Theron couldn't quite parse. Something in the way their eyes met that suggested depths of connection he'd never achieved with anyone. "Why?" Elara finally asked. "Why now? Why this? You had 3 years to be different. 3 years to choose anything except what you became. Why does it take losing us, losing your position, losing your honor? Why does it take all that before you can admit you were wrong?" "Because I was afraid," Theron said, and saying it out loud was harder than facing enemy fire had ever been. Afraid that if I showed weakness, if I admitted I was struggling, if I asked for help, then everyone would see what I already knew. That I'm not the decorated soldier, not the competent commander. I'm just terrified man who watched too many people die and couldn't figure out how to live with that. He looked at his hands, scarred from years of warfare. The border campaigns broke something in me. Maybe everyone who goes through them breaks differently. Or maybe I was weak in ways others weren't. But I let that brokenness become cruelty, and there's no excuse for that. Kaelin moved to the fire, settling into position that suggested he was settling in for serious discussion. Atonement debt is ancient law and binding. You'd be sworn to their protection until they reach adulthood, which for these 3 might be 9 years or might be 12 depending on how they develop. During that time, you follow orders without question, you prioritize their safety over your own, and you accept that the moment you violate that oath, your life is forfeit with no trial or mercy. He paused. It's also irreversible. You can't wake up one day and decide you're done. You serve the full term or you die trying. "I understand." "Do you?" Kaelin's voice sharpened. "Because I've seen a lot of warriors claim they want redemption when what they really want is absolution. They want someone to tell them it's okay, that they're forgiven, that they can go back to being whoever they were before. Atonement debt doesn't work that way. It's hard, daily, unglamorous work. It's changing diapers and night watch and putting yourself between them and any threat for years on end. It's service without recognition, protection without praise. Most warriors who offer it change their minds within a month. Then most warriors don't mean it when they offer. Theron met Kaelin's eyes. I do. I need this. Not for forgiveness, I don't expect that, but to prove to myself that I can be something other than what I became. To show those daughters that the male who failed them at birth can at least serve them in life. Ilara spoke then, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. I want conditions. You don't discipline them, ever. You don't contradict my parenting. You don't try to rebuild relationship with me beyond professional courtesy. Your service is to them, not to assuaging your guilt through me. She paused, and something fierce showed through. And you teach them. When they're old enough, you teach them every tactical lesson you know, every combat skill you possess, every piece of military knowledge you've accumulated. You make them into warriors who could defeat you at your best. That's my price. Theron felt somethings in his chest that might have been the first stirrings of hope in longer than he could remember. Done, all of it without reservation. Then kneel, Kaelin commanded, and his voice carried the weight of ages, of authority that predated modern pack structure. Repeat the oath as I speak it, and understand that breaking it means death without trial. Theron knelt, and the words came, formal and binding, spoken in language that was older than the codes he'd learned in military academy. He swore on his life and honor, on his strength and skill, on everything he'd been and everything he might become. He swore to protect Senna and Sable and Lyric until they reached adulthood, to prioritize their safety over his own, to serve without recognition or reward. And when the oath was complete, Kaelin placed his hand on Theron's head in the ancient gesture of acceptance, and something fundamental shifted in the universe. Your atonement begins now, Kaelin said. First task is to return to your lines, report to Declan, and tell him I'm willing to negotiate, but only if he comes himself. No intermediaries, no subordinates. The war leader wants to talk. He climbs this mountain and faces me as equal. He paused. Second task is to not die when Declan decides whether to execute you for desertion. I'd prefer my newest oath-bound guardians survive at least until sunrise. Despite everything, Theron almost smiled. I'll do my best. He left the cave with dawn breaking over the eastern peaks, descended the mountain with legs that shook from more than just the climb, and walked back into the siege perimeter, expecting to be arrested immediately. What he found instead was Garrett waiting with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he'd seen everything and chosen to say nothing. Commander wants to see you, Garrett said, handing over one of the cups. You might want to drink that first. He's in what I'd characterize as a complicated mood. Declan's command tent was sparse and functional, maps covering every surface, communication equipment maintained to perfect specifications. The war leader himself stood studying a topographic display of the mountain, and he didn't turn when Theron entered. Just spoke to the map, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd already decided something and was working through how to implement it. You deserted your post, in field conditions, during siege operations. Statement of facts, delivered without inflection. By all rights, I should have you executed before sunset. Theron stood at attention, accepting whatever judgment came. Yes, sir. You also climbed alone into enemy territory, exposed yourself to potential capture or death, and somehow returned with intelligence I couldn't have obtained through any conventional means. Now Declan turned, and his expression was unreadable. The Warlord will negotiate, but only with me, personally, no intermediaries. That suggests he sees this as commander-to-commander discussion, which means he's treating us as equals, which is either encouraging or deeply troubling depending on perspective. He's offering a way forward that doesn't require bloodshed, sir. Yes, I gathered that from the fact that he didn't kill you for walking into his home uninvited. Declan moved to his field desk, pulling out a document that Theron recognized as Articles of Military Justice. The punishment for desertion in field conditions is execution. However, there's an exception clause for warriors who desert for purpose of parley with enemy commanders, returning with actionable intelligence. He looked up. Did you desert for tactical reasons or personal ones? It was a lifeline, an opportunity to craft a narrative that would save his life through technicality. Theron could claim strategic thinking, could frame his actions as initiative rather than abandonment. but he'd spent too many years lying to himself to start lying to others. "Personal, sir. I wronged the female he's protecting. I needed to face that, to offer atonement according to ancient law. The intelligence was incidental to that purpose." Declan studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He smiled, and it wasn't cruel or mocking. It was almost approving. "You just chose integrity over survival. That's interesting. The Theron I sent up that mountain the first time would have lied without hesitation, would have crafted whatever story preserved his position." He returned the document to his desk. "I'm not executing you. Partly because you brought back information I need, but mostly because whatever happened up there changed something. You came back different. I'd like to understand why before I decide if that's good or bad." Relief and confusion warred in Theron's chest. "I don't understand, sir. I'm questioning whether everything I've built over the past 2 centuries was necessary caution or convenient cruelty," Declan said, and hearing the war leader admit doubt was like watching mountains acknowledge they might be made of sand. "If a warrior like you, decorated and competent and loyal, can look at our culture and see something that turned you into a monster, maybe the problem isn't individual weakness. Maybe it's systemic failure." He moved to the tent entrance, staring toward the mountain where Kaelin waited. "So I'm going to climb up there and talk to the one wolf who warned us this might happen. And you're coming with me, because I want him to see what his theories did when they met reality." 2 hours later, Declan and Theron began the climb with Garrett accompanying as witness and communication specialist. No weapons beyond what was required for mountain travel, no equipment that could be construed as aggressive. This was parley, ancient tradition that even bitter enemies honored, and Declan maintained its protocols scrupulously. Kaelin met them at the cave entrance, human form but radiating the kind of contained power that made it clear he could shift and be on them before they could react. Behind him, visible in the cave's depths, Ilara maintained position with her daughters, close enough to hear, far enough to escape if things went violent. "War leader," Kaelin said, and it was greeting and acknowledgement both. "It's been a long time." 200 years, Declan agreed. "Last time we spoke, you were walking away from everything we'd built together. Said you couldn't be part of what we were becoming. And you said I was idealistic fool who didn't understand that survival required hard choices." Kaelin gestured toward the cave. "Looks like we both had points. Your hard choices kept the Pax alive through 2 centuries of preparation. My idealism preserved the memory of what we were supposed to be. Question now is whether there's a middle ground." They talked through the day and into the evening, 2 ancient warriors who'd once been friends discussing philosophy and tactics, policy and principle. Theron and Garrett listened, bearing witness to something rare. Commanders admitting uncertainty, questioning foundational assumptions, treating each other's perspectives as valuable even when they disagreed. The real breakthrough came when Declan finally addressed the underlying issue. The border kingdoms are mobilizing, not raids or skirmishes, but full-scale invasion. Our intelligence suggests they'll move within 60 days, maybe less. Everything I've done, every authoritarian policy, every suppression of dissent, it's been in service of preparing for that threat. I need absolute unity, complete commitment, 0 internal division when that invasion comes. And you think rigid hierarchy and female suppression creates unity? Kaelin's voice carried challenge, but also genuine curiosity. In my experience, people fight hardest when they're fighting for something they value, when they have stake in the outcome beyond following orders. You've created a culture where half your population is treated as expendable, where warriors are taught to suppress empathy as weakness, where loyalty means obedience rather than commitment. That doesn't build the kind of unity that survives real pressure. Then what does? And Declan sounded honestly curious, honestly willing to consider alternatives. "Trust," Kaelin said simply. "Trust that your subordinates are competent to make decisions. Trust that warriors will fight harder when they're fighting for mates and children they value, rather than hierarchy they resent. Trust that females in combat roles might actually be force multipliers, rather than liabilities." He paused. "You've been so focused on preparing to fight external threat that you've created internal brittleness. The moment your people have chance to choose something different, they will. Theron's already proof of that." Declan looked at Theron, really looked, seeing beyond the uniform and rank to the man beneath. "What changed? When you went back down the mountain the first time, you were ready to kill or die to retrieve your mate. Now you're oath-bound to protect daughters you once considered disposable. That's not small evolution. What happened? Theron took a breath, organizing thoughts he hadn't fully processed himself. I saw alternative. Saw a warrior treating his mate like equal. Saw him protecting children just because it was right thing to do. Saw him defeating superior force through tactical excellence rather than brutal discipline. And I realized that everything I'd become, everything I thought made me strong, actually made me weak, made me into something I despised. He met Declan's eyes. You taught us that compassion was exploitable weakness. He showed us that compassion channeled through competence was actually force multiplier, that protecting those weaker than yourself didn't make you vulnerable. It gave you purpose beyond just surviving. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Declan nodded slowly. If the invasion comes and we're fractured, we lose. If we maintain current approach and our warriors resent what they're fighting for, we lose. Only path forward is integration, is proving that trust works better than control. He looked at Kaelin. You want to help? Really help, not just protect one female and her daughters? Then come down from this mountain and lead again. Show us how to build culture that's both strong enough to win wars and humane enough to deserve winning. Kaelin was quiet for a long moment. And if I do, you step down? Let new council form that includes voices you've been suppressing? After the invasion? After we survive? Then yes, I'll step aside and let the culture evolve. Declan extended his hand. But we survive first. We build something worth protecting, then we defend it together. Deal? Kaelin clasped his hand, warrior to warrior, equal to equal. Deal. On condition that changes start now, not after crisis passes. Female warriors integrated immediately, command structure flattened to permit initiative, oath-bound service recognized as legitimate path to atonement. We prove it works by doing it, not by promising eventually. Agreed. And Declan actually smiled. Welcome back, Warlord. We've missed you. The siege ended that night without additional bloodshed. 50 warriors who'd come to enforce council authority instead received orders to return to Frostridge territory and begin preparing for integration. Theron remained with Kaelin, beginning his oath-bound service by helping fortify the mountain position against possible border incursion. Garrett volunteered to serve as liaison between Kaelin's position and council headquarters, ensuring communication stayed open. But the real transformation happened in the conversations around evening fires, as warriors who'd lived by rigid hierarchy began imagining alternatives, as females who'd been classified as non-combatants started asking about training, as the culture that had calcified over 2 centuries began, slowly and painfully, to remember what it had been before fear replaced trust. On the 20th night after the siege ended, a scout brought news that changed everything. The border kingdoms weren't preparing to invade. They were already invading. 60 days had been intelligence failure, either through enemy deception or council miscalculation. The actual timeline was 10 days, and 3 of those had already passed. Declan sent emergency summons to every available warrior. Kaelin descended from his mountain, with Alara and their daughters, moving toward battle he'd spent 2 centuries avoiding. Theron marched beside them, oath-bound and committed, finding purpose in protection he'd once dismissed. But the real surprise waited at the border itself. The enemy commander who'd spent a decade planning this invasion, who'd maneuvered pieces into place with patient precision, who'd calculated that Frostridge Pack would be fractured and vulnerable, that commander had a name that Kaelin recognized. Marcus, his brother. The one who'd survived the Purge, who'd carried hatred for 200 years, who'd promised revenge regardless of cost. The real war was just beginning, and it would take everything they'd rebuilt, everything they'd learned, everything they'd become to survive what was coming. But standing there on the edge of battle, surrounded by warriors who'd chosen trust over control, commitment over obedience, Kaelin felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 centuries. Hope. Fragile and uncertain, but real. The kind worth fighting for. The kind worth dying for if necessary. The siege had ended. The war had just begun, and whatever happened next would determine whether 200 years of isolation and preparation would culminate in survival or destruction. But at least they'd face it together, as warriors who'd earned each other's respect, as leaders who'd learned that strength without honor was just brutality with a uniform. And somewhere in that realization, in that commitment to something larger than individual survival, they found the foundation for whatever came next. The mountain wind carried the scent of approaching war, but for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, it also carried something else, the possibility that they might actually deserve to win. The border stretched before them like a wound across the landscape, that contested zone where Frost Ridge territory met the kingdoms beyond. 7 days remained before Marcus's full invasion force would cross into Packlands with overwhelming numbers and 2 decades of meticulous planning behind them. 7 days to prepare defenses, coordinate forces, and somehow convince warriors who'd spent lifetimes following rigid doctrine that survival now depended on the very flexibility they'd been trained to suppress. Kalen stood on the ridgeline overlooking the approach routes, his 342 years of tactical experience mapping the terrain with automatic precision. Beside him, Declan reviewed disposition of their combined forces with the kind of methodical attention that had kept him alive through 4 centuries of warfare. 60 warriors, counting everyone who could hold a weapon and follow orders, against Marcus's 200 professional soldiers from 3 allied kingdoms who'd been preparing for this moment since before most of Frostridge's current generation was born. The mathematics were brutally simple. In open battle, they'd be overwhelmed within hours. Their only advantage was terrain knowledge, defensive positioning, and the integration of unconventional assets that Marcus wouldn't expect. Female warriors, recently trained and hungry to prove their worth. Younger wolves given initiative instead of rigid orders. Tactics that prioritized adaptability over adherence to doctrine. Everything Kalen had advocated for 2 centuries ago, now being tested under conditions where failure meant extinction. "He'll come through the western approach," Kalen said, tracing the route on the map spread across a makeshift command table. "It's the obvious choice. Widest front, easiest terrain for maneuvering large formations. He'll expect us to defend there. We'll have planned his entire assault around breaking our lines in that sector." Declan nodded, following the logic. "So we give him what he expects, but not in the way he anticipates. Heavy defense on the western approach, but built around mobile elements that can fall back through prepared positions rather than holding fixed lines. Make him pay for every yard while preserving our forces." "Exactly." Kalen shifted his attention to the eastern routes, narrower and more treacherous. "But the real fight happens here. Small teams infiltrating through terrain he'll consider impassable, hitting supply lines, command elements, creating chaos in his rear areas. That's where female warriors and younger wolves excel, in fluid situations that require initiative and adaptation." Alara approached then, moving with the confident stride of someone who'd spent the past weeks training harder than she'd ever trained in her life. Behind her came a dozen other females, each carrying weapons they'd learned to use with growing competence. Not yet at the level of veteran soldiers, but capable enough to be dangerous in the right circumstances. "We're ready," she said, and there was steel in her voice that hadn't been there during those desperate days fleeing through mountain winter. "Tell us where you need us." Over the next 6 days, they prepared with the intensity of people who understood that every decision, every placement, every contingency plan might be the difference between survival and annihilation. Kalen found himself teaching tactics he'd developed centuries ago, watching young wolves absorb lessons with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood the stakes. Theron worked beside him, translating theory into practical application, his expertise in small unit tactics proving invaluable. On the 3rd day of preparation, Garrett intercepted a scout report that changed their tactical picture. Marcus's invasion force had split into 3 elements, the main body approaching through the western route as expected, but 2 smaller forces moving to flank through northern and southern approaches. Classical hammer and anvil tactics, designed to pin defenders in place while mobile elements encircled from multiple directions. "He learned from the best," Declan said, studying the updated intelligence with something that might have been grudging admiration. "That's the formation we used during the Consolidation Wars, the one that broke the last independent packs. He's using our own doctrine against us." Kalen stared at the map, memories flooding back unbidden. He'd been the one to develop that formation, had commanded its first successful deployment against enemies who'd thought themselves unbeatable. Now his own innovations were being turned against the people he'd sworn to protect. There was bitter irony in that, the kind that made ancient warriors question whether any tactical brilliance was worth the long-term cost. "Then we counter with something he hasn't seen," Kaelin said, making decisions with the clarity that came from absolute necessity. "We let him execute the encirclement. Let him think it's working. Then we collapse our perimeter deliberately, pull everyone into a concentrated defensive position here." He indicated a valley with natural choke points on 3 sides. "Force him to attack uphill through limited approaches where his numbers become a liability. Classic last stand positioning, but we're choosing the ground instead of being driven to it." The plan was risky, dependent on precise timing, and warriors trusting that apparent retreat was actually strategic repositioning. But it was also their best chance, maybe their only chance, of surviving long enough to force Marcus into a position where his overwhelming advantage became manageable challenge. On the 7th day, scouts brought word that Marcus's forces had crossed into Frostridge territory and were advancing on schedule. The invasion that had been abstract threat for so long was now immediate reality, measured in hours rather than days. Warriors who'd spent weeks preparing suddenly faced the knowledge that all their training, all their planning, all their hope would be tested against an enemy who'd been planning this moment for decades. Kaelin gathered the commanders for final briefing and found himself looking at faces both familiar and new. Declan, ancient and competent, bearing the weight of 2 centuries of leadership. Theron, transformed by oath-bound service from brutal enforcer to committed protector. Garrett, steady and reliable, the kind of soldier who held units together through competence and quiet courage. Alara, still learning but fierce in her determination, representing a dozen other females who'd fought for the right to defend their home. And others, younger warriors who'd grown up under Declan's authoritarian structure but were now being asked to think independently, to make decisions, to trust their own judgment. "You all know the plan," Kaelin said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded armies when most of their grandparents were still alive. "You know your positions, your fallback routes, your sector responsibilities, but the most important thing to remember is this: doctrine is guide, not gospel. When situations change, adapt. When opportunities present themselves, take them. Trust your training, but more importantly, trust yourselves." He paused, meeting each commander's eyes in turn. Marcus is brilliant tactician with superior numbers and decades of preparation. But he's also rigid, locked into the very doctrines I taught him before I understood their limitations. Our advantage is that we're willing to be unpredictable, to improvise, to value outcomes over adherence to plans. Use that. They dispersed to their units, and Kaelin found himself alone with Declan in the pre-battle quiet that every veteran recognized. That strange suspended moment when preparation was complete and action hadn't yet begun, when the mind could wander into all the futures that might never happen. "If this goes wrong," Declan said quietly, "if Marcus breaks through and I don't survive, I want you to know something. Everything I built over 2 centuries, every harsh policy and authoritarian measure, I genuinely believed it was necessary. I thought I was preserving our people through strength and discipline." He paused. "I was wrong. Not about the external threat, that was real, but about how to build culture capable of surviving it. You were right 200 years ago, and I was too proud or too afraid to admit it." Kaelin nodded slowly. "And I was wrong to walk away instead of fighting for what I believed. Easier to abandon you all than to do the hard work of changing minds and hearts. We've both made mistakes, old friend. Question now is whether we can survive them long enough to do better." The first contact came at dawn, Marcus's scouts probing defensive positions with professional competence. Small skirmishes erupted along the Western Front, testing Frostridge's response times and coordination. Kaelin watched from his command position, reading the engagement patterns, recognizing his brother's tactical fingerprints in the careful, methodical approach. Marcus was being cautious, unwilling to commit to major assault without full intelligence picture. That caution would be his undoing, but he didn't know it yet. Every minute he spent in reconnaissance was another minute for Frostridge forces to complete their positioning, to move pieces into place for the collapse and consolidation that would define the real battle. By midday, Marcus had committed his main force to the western assault, exactly as predicted. 200 wolves moving in coordinated formations, professional military operation executed with textbook precision. They hit Frostridge's forward positions expecting resistance, finding instead measured withdrawal. Warriors falling back through prepared routes, giving ground but inflicting casualties, making the advance costly without being decisively engaged. To observers, it looked like collapse. To Kaelin, watching from his position, it looked like perfect execution of a plan that required warriors to trust leadership enough to follow orders that seemed like defeat. Every unit retreating on schedule, maintaining cohesion, moving toward the valley position where the real stand would happen. Marcus recognized the trap approximately 30 seconds too late. His forces, spread across multiple approach routes during the pursuit, suddenly found themselves funneling into a valley with limited exits and elevated defensive positions on 3 sides. The advantageous ground they'd been claiming for hours transformed into a killing ground where every wolf attempting to advance had to move through interlocking fields of fire. "Now," Kaelin said quietly, and signal flags went up. The real battle began with the kind of coordinated violence that separated trained militaries from armed mobs. Frostridge forces, concentrated and positioned, delivering overwhelming firepower into approach routes that couldn't be bypassed. Female warriors on elevated positions providing ranged support with accuracy that shocked Marcus's veterans. Younger wolves executing small unit tactics with the kind of initiative that rigid doctrine never produced. It wasn't enough to win. Marcus still had superior numbers, and he adapted quickly, pulling back from the initial assault and repositioning for a more careful approach. But it was enough to equalize, to transform what should have been one-sided slaughter into genuine contest between matched opponents. The battle raged through afternoon and into evening, neither side gaining decisive advantage. Warriors on both sides bled and died, the mathematics of warfare reducing individual stories to tactical statistics. Kaelin commanded from his position, making adjustments, reinforcing sectors under pressure, exploiting opportunities when Marcus's formations exposed weaknesses. Across the valley, he could see his brother doing the same, 2 commanders engaged in the kind of deadly chess game that both had trained for across lifetimes. As night fell, both forces pulled back to lick wounds and reassess. First day had gone to Frostridge in that they'd survived it, but Marcus still held numerical advantage and hadn't committed his full strength. Tomorrow would bring renewed assault, and the question was whether Frostridge's positions could hold against an enemy who now understood their tactics. Kaelin walked through the defensive lines as darkness deepened, checking on wounded warriors, reviewing ammunition supplies, maintaining the kind of visible command presence that kept exhausted soldiers fighting when their bodies screamed to quit. He found Theron at one of the forward positions, tending to an injured warrior with the kind of focused care that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with simple compassion. "Your daughters are safe," Theron said without looking up from his work. "Elara has them secured in the rear position with guards I trust personally. Whatever happens here, they're protected." "I know." Kaelin settled beside him, helping with the bandaging. "You've honored your oath beyond what most warriors would manage. When this is over, when they're grown, you'll have earned more than just atonement. You'll have earned respect." Theron was quiet for a moment. "I don't need respect. I need to live with myself. Everything else is just details." He finished securing the bandage and moved to the next wounded warrior. "But I appreciate you saying it." The second day began with Marcus attempting a different approach. Instead of direct assault, he split his forces and began systematic pressure on multiple sectors simultaneously, trying to identify weak points in Frostridge's defense. It was sound strategy, the kind that ground down defenders through sustained attrition rather than risking everything on single breakthrough attempt. It was also exactly what Kaelin had been waiting for. Marcus's scattered formations, spread across multiple sectors, were vulnerable to counterattack from forces they didn't know existed. The female warriors and younger wolves who'd been held in reserve, waiting for opportunity, who could move through terrain Marcus's scouts had dismissed as impassable. "Execute infiltration," Kaelin ordered, and Elara led her teams into the broken ground behind Marcus's lines. What followed was chaos of the best kind, from Frostridge's perspective. Small teams hitting supply caches, command posts, communication lines. creating confusion and forcing Marcus to divert forces from his main assault to deal with threats in his rear. It wasn't decisive, wasn't enough to break his army, but it slowed his advance and bought time Frostridge desperately needed. By the third day, the battle had devolved into brutal stalemate. Marcus couldn't break through Frostridge's positions without taking casualties he couldn't afford. Frostridge couldn't drive Marcus back without abandoning their defensive advantages. Both sides were bleeding from a dozen small engagements, both commanders recognizing that continuing this way would result in mutual destruction. That's when Marcus sent the challenge, not through messenger or signal, but by walking into no man's land alone, unarmed, in full view of both armies. The ancient ritual of commander's duel, settling the conflict through single combat between leaders rather than continuing to spend warriors' lives. Kaelin saw him and felt something twist in his chest. 200 years since they'd faced each other, 2 centuries since the purge had driven them apart. Marcus looked older than Kaelin remembered, scarred in ways that went beyond physical wounds, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who carried pain as constant companion. "Brother," Marcus called across the distance between them. "Let's end this. You and me, like we should have 200 years ago. Winner takes the field, loser's forces withdraw. No more warriors have to die for our failure to resolve what's between us." Kaelin emerged from Frostridge lines, also unarmed, also alone. They met in the center of no man's land, 2 ancient warriors who'd once been closer than brothers, separated by choices and consequences that had festered for 2 centuries into this moment. "You survived," Kaelin said, and it came out more complicated than simple statement of fact. Relief and regret and grief all tangled together. "Barely." Marcus's voice was rough, damaged by old wounds that had never healed properly. "The village you bombed, the one Declan said held enemy combatants, I was there visiting my mate. She died in the first strike. Our 2 sons died trying to protect her." His eyes, one scarred and milky, the other burning with focused intensity, held Kaelin's. "You gave that order. You trusted Declan's intelligence, and my family burned because you believed him over your own judgment." The words landed like physical blows. Kaelin had known intellectually that innocents had died in that strike, but knowing abstractly and hearing the specific details, understanding that his brother's family had been among the casualties, that transformed abstract guilt into something immediate and devastating. "I didn't know," he managed. "Marcus, I swear I didn't know you were there. Declan said military target, high-value enemies. I trusted his assessment. If I'd known—" "You would have what? Disobeyed orders? Questioned your war leader?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "No, you would have done exactly what you did, because you were a good soldier, and good soldiers follow orders even when their instincts scream something's wrong." He paused. "I spent 200 years hating you for that, building this army, planning this invasion, all to destroy what you valued the way you destroyed what I valued. So let's finish it." Kaelin's voice steadied, accepting whatever judgment was coming. "You want my life for theirs? I won't fight you. I've spent 2 centuries living with that guilt. If dying ends it, I'm ready." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, and something complicated moved behind his eyes. "That's the problem, isn't it? You're ready to die. You've been ready since the moment you realized what you'd done. Walking away to that mountain, living in isolation, maintaining skills you never used. That was all just slow suicide stretched over centuries." He shook his head. "I don't want you dead, brother. I want you to live with what you did, the way I've had to live with it. I want you to wake up every day remembering that your choices have consequences, that following orders doesn't absolve responsibility, that sometimes the only honorable path is refusing to follow commands you know are wrong." "Then what do you want?" Kaelin's voice cracked. "Marcus, what will end this?" "Admission. Public, official admission that Declan's intelligence was false, that the purge targeted civilian population to eliminate dissent, that warriors following orders committed atrocities." Marcus's voice went harder. "I want Declan stripped of command and tried for war crimes. I want the culture that enabled him held accountable. And I want you to spend whatever remains of your life building something better, so my sons didn't die for nothing." Behind them, both armies watched in tense silence. Kaelin turned, looking back toward Frostridge lines where Declan stood visible on the ridge. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. understanding that this moment had been inevitable since the purge, that all the preparation and policy and rigid structure had been unconscious attempt to avoid facing what they'd done. Declan descended from the ridge, walking alone into no man's land to join them. He moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd already made his decision, who'd been waiting for this moment even if he hadn't fully recognized it until now. "I gave the false intelligence," Declan said when he reached them. "I knew the village held civilians, knew your family was there, ordered the strike anyway because you were advocating for peace negotiations and I needed you discredited or eliminated." He spoke directly to Marcus, no deflection or justification. "You were Kaelin's closest advisor, his conscience, the one voice that could make him question orders. I couldn't allow that, not when I decided that absolute authority was only way to ensure survival." Marcus's remaining good eye widened. "You knew? All this time Kaelin thought he'd failed through incompetence, and you knew you'd deliberately set him up?" "Yes." Declan's voice never wavered. "I convinced myself it was necessary, that individual lives were acceptable cost for pack survival. I was wrong. Wrong about the necessity, wrong about the morality, wrong about everything except my own fear." He looked at Kaelin. "You walked away because you thought you'd failed as commander. Truth is, you were betrayed by someone you trusted. I've spent 2 centuries letting you carry that guilt while knowing I was the one who deserved it." The silence that followed was absolute. 3 ancient warriors standing in no man's land, truth finally spoken after 2 centuries of lies and misdirection and guilt distributed to the wrong shoulders. Around them, both armies waited to see how this revelation would reshape everything. "Trial by combat," Marcus said finally. "Not to death, to submission. You and me, Declan. For my mate and sons, for Kaelin's stolen years, for every warrior who died because you decided fear was better leadership than trust. We fight, and whoever wins sets the terms going forward." Declan nodded acceptance. "Agreed. If I win, you withdraw and we negotiate borders without further bloodshed. If you win, I step down and face whatever justice you require." They fought with the kind of brutal efficiency that came from centuries of experience. Marcus, scarred and damaged but driven by 200 years of focused rage. Declan, older and more experienced but fighting with the heavy weight of guilt, finally acknowledged. It was savage and technical, 2 masters of their craft holding nothing back. It ended when Declan made the choice that maybe he'd been building towards since the purge. Marcus had an opening, a moment where victory was available if he committed fully. Instead of defending, instead of using the counter that would have turned the attack back on his opponent, Declan simply stopped fighting, dropped his guard, and exposed his throat in the universal gesture of surrender. "I don't deserve victory," he said quietly. "Whatever justice you want, take it. I'm done running from what I did." Marcus stood over him, breathing hard, torn between the vengeance he'd planned for decades and the complicated reality of facing an enemy who'd stopped defending himself. For a long moment, the outcome balanced on edge. Then Marcus stepped back. "Death would be mercy you haven't earned," he said. "So you live. You face trial, you accept judgment, and you spend whatever time remains building something better than what you created." He looked at Kaelin. "And you help him, not as his subordinate, but as the check on his authority you should have been 2 centuries ago. The 2 of you failed together. Now you rebuild together." The years that followed became testament to what warriors could build when they chose accountability over convenient lies. Treaty negotiations stretched through winter months, every clause debated, every provision tested against the question of whether it served justice or merely expedience. Marcus remained as ambassador, his presence ensuring that promises made were actually kept. Declan faced tribunal for his crimes, was stripped of war leader title, but granted conditional freedom in exchange for his expertise in rebuilding military culture with proper oversight. And Kaelin found himself doing the work he should have done 2 centuries ago, leading transformation not through isolation or abdication, but through daily commitment to principles he'd once only theorized about. It was harder than warfare, more exhausting than any campaign, but it was also necessary in ways that combat never was. The changes came slowly, measured in seasons rather than days. Female warriors proved their worth repeatedly until skeptics ran out of objections. Younger wolves given real authority developed into leaders who thought strategically instead of just following doctrine. The rigid hierarchy that had characterized Frostridge for 2 centuries began to flatten, not through revolution but through evolution, as warriors discovered that trust worked better than control. Theron served his oath-bound term with the kind of faithful commitment that transformed obligation into something deeper. He protected Senna and Sable and Lyric through childhood years, teaching them combat techniques and tactical thinking, present for every milestone and challenge. When Lyric turned 9 and his oath was technically complete, he asked to extend it until they reached adulthood. By the time they turned 18, the distinction between oath-bound service and chosen family had blurred beyond recognition. 15 years after the battle that almost destroyed Frostridge, Kaelin stood at the training grounds watching a new generation practice techniques that integrated everything they'd learned. Males and females training together, not as experiment, but as established practice. Instructors who taught initiative alongside discipline, adaptation alongside doctrine. Senna was there, now 24, moving through weapon forms with the kind of unconscious competence that came from a lifetime of training. She'd grown into the warrior her mother had dreamed of being, but with something extra, something that came from never having to fight for the right to be taken seriously. She simply was, and that certainty showed in every movement. Nearby, Sable worked with younger recruits on diplomatic protocols, her natural gift for reading people making her invaluable in negotiations. Where Senna led through demonstrated competence, Sable led through understood connection, the ability to find common ground where others saw only division. And Lyric, ranging the perimeter with scout teams, her enhanced senses making her invaluable for border security. She'd taken to the work like she was born for it, spending more time in the wilderness than in settled territory, happiest when moving through terrain that would challenge most wolves. 3 daughters, 3 completely different paths, each proving in their own way that the world they'd helped build had room for all of them. "They're better than we were," Theron said, settling beside Kaelin. He was 50 now, showing his age but moving with the satisfied weariness of someone who'd lived his years well. Not just in skills, though they've got those, better in how they see the world. They don't carry our damage, don't fight our battles. They've got their own challenges, but they face them without our baggage. "That was the point," Kaelin replied. "We break ourselves so they don't have to. We make the mistakes, pay for them, build something better. Then we trust them to take it further than we ever could." 20 years after the battle, they held ceremony to mark the formal transition. New council structure, expanded representation, policies built on 2 decades of tested practice rather than desperate theory. Declan, now 640 years old, formally stepped down from all remaining positions. Marcus, having served as ambassador for 2 decades, returned to his kingdom but left his eldest son to maintain the relationship they'd built. And Kaelin, after 2 centuries of isolation followed by 2 decades of rebuilding, passed leadership to the next generation. But this wasn't abdication or retreat. This was trust, earned and given, the recognition that his role had been to build foundation, not to occupy it forever. The ceremony itself was simple, in keeping with warrior tradition. No elaborate speeches, just formal transfer of authority and acknowledgement that leadership was temporary trust rather than permanent possession. But when Senna stood to accept her seat on the new council, when Sable and Lyric joined her representing different aspects of pack governance, the significance was unmistakable. Senna spoke first, her voice carrying the natural authority she'd inherited from both parents. "We stand here because warriors before us chose to change, chose to question assumptions, to challenge traditions, to build something better than what they inherited." She looked directly at Kaelin. "You showed us that strength isn't about dominance. It's about service, about showing up every day to do the work, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. We'll carry that forward." Sable's contribution was more personal. "My earliest memory is of Theron teaching me to read tactical maps. Not because I had to learn, but because he thought I'd want to know. He treated a 3-year-old like her questions mattered, like her mind was worth developing." She turned to Theron. "You taught us that redemption isn't dramatic gesture. It's daily choice to be better than you were yesterday. Thank you for choosing that every single day." Lyric, uncomfortable with formal speaking but managing anyway, kept it brief. "We hunt together now. Males and females, experienced and new, different skills and approaches, all working toward common purpose. That's not how it was 20 years ago. That's what you built. We'll protect it. The gathering afterward was veteran reunion and changing of guard simultaneously. Garrett, now 65 and retired from active service, shared stories with young warriors who'd never known the old ways. Marcus and Declan engaged in their usual philosophical debate, this one about whether perfect systems were possible or whether good enough systems were the best anyone could hope for. Alara moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and gratitude, still carrying herself like the warrior she'd become. And Kalen found himself standing with Theron and Marcus, 3 warriors who'd traveled such different paths to arrive at this moment. "Your sons would be proud," Kalen said quietly to Marcus. "The world we've built, it's the one they should have grown up in." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Maybe. Or maybe they'd be like these young ones, taking it all for granted because they don't remember when it was different. He smiled slightly. "Either way, it's better. That's what matters. Not that they'd appreciate it, but that it exists for them to take for granted." "I spent 18 years thinking redemption was impossible," Theron said. "That what I'd done couldn't be balanced by anything I could do afterward. But watching those 3 daughters become who they are, knowing I was part of that even in a small way, I've learned something. Redemption isn't about balance. It's about building something good enough that it justifies the cost of your failures." 5 years later, Kalen returned to his mountain. Not in isolation this time, but in earned rest, the kind that comes from work completed and responsibility transferred. Alara came with him, their bond deepened by decades of partnership. The cave was different now, no longer prison but retreat, a place to observe the world they'd built without needing to constantly maintain it. Warriors visited regularly, Theron and Garrett making the climb to share stories and argue about tactics. The daughters bringing news of council decisions and border negotiations. Marcus, once a year on the anniversary of the Purge, making pilgrimage that honored both what was lost and what was built from those ashes. On one such evening, as sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Kalen stood at the peak overlook with Alara beside him. Below, in valleys and territories stretching to horizons, life continued in patterns they'd helped establish, but no longer controlled. Warriors training, families forming, leaders making decisions, all of it flowing forward without needing them at its center. "Do you have regrets?" Alara asked. "Hundreds," Kalen admitted. "Choices I'd make differently. Pain I'd prevent if I could. Years I wasted before I understood what mattered." He paused. "But not this. Not us. Not the daughters we raised. Not the world we helped transform. Those I'd fight for again. Knowing everything." "Good," she said simply. "Because they're doing exactly what we hoped. Building on our foundation while fixing our mistakes. Making tomorrow better than today. That's what legacy actually means." The sun set completely, darkness rising from the valleys. Behind them, the cave held warmth and the sounds of visiting family. Ahead, territories stretched toward futures they'd never see, carrying forward work they'd begun. And in the balance between past and future, memory and hope, guilt and purpose, Kalen found what every warrior who'd lived too long ultimately sought. Not redemption exactly, not absolution for choices that couldn't be unmade, but the knowledge that their lives had mattered, that their choices, good and bad, had shaped the world in ways that made tomorrow possible. That the next generation would face their own challenges with better tools than they'd inherited. The war was over. The transformation continued, and 2 warriors who'd earned their rest finally allowed themselves to believe they'd done enough. The mountain wind carried scents of pine and stone and the vast emptiness of high places, but it also carried something new, the sounds of a world that had learned to value trust over control, partnership over domination, earned respect over inherited authority. They'd survived. More than that, they'd built something worth surviving for. In the gathering darkness, Alara's hand found his. They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 warriors who'd earned each other and everything they'd built. Below them, the world continued its work. Above them, stars wheeled through eternal patterns, bearing witness to warriors who'd struggled and survived and learned, finally, what honor actually meant. Not glory, not victory, just showing up every day and doing the work, trusting that accumulated effort across decades and generations would matter in ways individual battles never could. And after 367 years of warfare and exile and rebuilding, after watching others carry forward what he'd started, after seeing his daughters become the leaders their world needed, Kaelin understood the final lesson. Leadership wasn't about being indispensable. It was about building something strong enough to thrive when you stepped away. He'd spent 200 years learning that through isolation. He'd spent 2 decades proving it through service. Now he embodied it through trust, believing that the next generation would do better with different challenges than his generation had managed with theirs. It was enough. It had to be. And standing on his mountain with the woman who'd made it all possible, surrounded by evidence that their struggle had meant something, Kaelin allowed himself the luxury of peace. The First Warlord had come home, not to die but to rest, and that, after everything, was victory of the truest kind.